Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on the modern papacy. Last time we proceeded up to the death of Pope John the 23rd on June 3rd, 1963, after a reign of 4 years and 8 months. He was beatified by Pope John Paul II in the year 2000 and canonized by Pope Francis in the year 2014. The conclave of 1963 was attended by 80 cardinals, which was the largest conclave up to that date in church history. On the fifth ballot, the college elected Giovanni Battista Montini, Montini, as the 262nd Pope. He accepted election on June 21st, 1963. He announced that he would take the name Paul because St. Paul reached out to the world, and he wished his pontificate to be characterized by that same impulse. From his perspective, the last pope to have taken the name Paul V, reigned from 1605 to 1621. Pope Paul VI reigned for 15 years and 1 month until his death on August 6th, 1978. Upon the death of John the 23rd, the council was suspended, and it would be up to the next pope to decide to continue or not, and Paul VI announced that he would reopen the council. By way of personal background, Montini was born in northern Italy, in the Diocese of Brescia, Brescia, on the 26th of September, 1897, making Montini the last pope born in the 19th century. He was born into the professional class rather than the aristocracy. His father was an attorney, but successful, so it was what we would think of as upper middle class. The family's wealth enabled Montini to receive his early education at home with private tutors. His father was also politically active. He was a member of the Italian Parliament. Recall that Italy in 1860 was united under a constitutional monarchy, the House of Sabaudia, which derived from the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, Savoy. And in 1860, that kingdom stole all of the papal states outside of Italy. And then in 1870, stole Rome. 1860 stole all of the papal states outside of Rome, and then in 1870 stole Rome outside of Vatican City. At that point, the Pope was Pius IX, and he prohibited Catholics from cooperating with this new government, the Italian government, since it had stolen the papal state. So the involvement of Montini's father in the Italian Parliament was an act of defiance of this papal prohibition. And that prohibition was not rescinded until 1929 by Pius XI. Montini, and I forgot if I spelled it or not, but it's Montini. Montini was ordained a priest for the Diocese of Brescia on May 29th, 1920. He was sent to Rome to study diplomacy. And in 1922, he was accepted into the Papal Diplomatic Corps by Pope Benedict XV. As part of his duties, he spent time working in the nunciature in Warsaw, Poland, following the First World War. This brought him into personal contact with Achille Ratti, Ratti, who became Pope Pius XI, and who would foster Montini's career just as he did for Angelo Roncalli before Roncalli became John the 23rd. Montini shared their ecclesiology, the what today would be called the progressive or transformationist ecclesiology, meaning that the best way for the church to deal with the modern world was to fully enter into it, become involved with it, and convert it from within. In this period, Montini met and befriended a Italian layman named Aldo Moro. First name Aldo, last name Moro. Lived from 1916 to 1978. He was a social activist who later became a leader of the Italian Christian Democratic Party. In the post-war elections, post-World War II elections, in 1946, Aldo Moro gained a seat in the Italian legislature representing the Christian Democratic Party. He eventually served as premier of Italy 5 times, leading coalitions of multiple parties. From 63 to 64, then later in 64 to 66, then later in 66 to 68, then 1974 to 76, and then again later in 76. Now, I know for Americans this doesn't make sense, but in the parliamentary system, like our executive officer, the president, has a 4-year term, period, and then comes up for election. Whereas with the parliamentary systems, the executive officer, while they do have terms, nevertheless, there can be a vote of no confidence in the premier, and so governments can collapse before their term is up. And that's happened frequently in Italy. Because they have another characteristic of parliamentary systems that differs from the American system, is they have multiple parties. So it often happens, in the case of Italian parliamentary history, that no single party gets over half the seats in the parliament. So the governments have to form coalitions of multiple parties, and that's inherently unstable. As if, if you have to form a coalition of 3 or 4 parties and one of them gets mad, well, then you no longer have a majority, then the government falls and there's more elections. So that's how it was possible for the guy to serve 5 terms. Anyway, this friendship was crucial in Montini's development. Moro was a lay Catholic in continuity with the 19th century articulation of liberal Catholicism, which we've covered previously in the reign of Pope Gregory XVI, meaning not only did he have a transformationist ecclesiology, believing that the church should be involved in the world, the modern world, but also that the church should form alliances with secular liberals and advocate as an ideal to be pursued, not just a condition that could be accepted, but an ideal to be pursued. Such Western liberal principles as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and separation of church and state. Aldo Moro shared with those that had that ecclesio-political attitude, a deeply rooted conviction that an active Catholic laity was essential to the health of both the secular and the sacred, to both church and state, especially the states in which the church existed around the world. Moro differed from those 19th century antecedents in that he was willing to go farther in reaching out. So he routinely, in his political career, formed common cause, not just with liberal Democrats, but with socialists, with self-declared, self-identified socialists. I mean, they actually had socialist parties in Italy. They still do. He would cooperate with them, even though they were atheist, technically atheist, not just technically, I mean, they're just declarative atheist. Nevertheless, he and as a leader of the Christian Democratic Party would form common cause with socialists in the parliament in order to pass laws that he deemed to be for the common good, even if those laws originated with proposals by socialists who in religious terms were either agnostic or atheist. Some regarded Montini's friendship with this guy, Aldo Moro, as a blemish. In retrospect, it may be observed that this friendship opened to Montini the possible contributions of an active Catholic laity for the Church and the world, and which affected the way that he is going to bring Vatican II to a conclusion. In this period, when he was still a priest, but when he knew Moro, but before he became a bishop, Father Montini became interested in the Italian Catholic students movement and in the priest-worker movement. In 1939, Eugenio Pacelli became Pope Pius XII. He regarded the priest-worker movement and the Catholic student movement as fronts for communist infiltration, benign fronts that were actually communist, but would sort of neutralize suspicion with these more benign, public projections. So that meant Pius XII did not trust Montini any longer in the diplomatic corps. So in 1938, Pius XII reassigned him to work in administration of internal church affairs at the Curia, holding the title of Pro-Secretary of State for Internal Affairs. Remember, there were two of them. Tardini was the other. And he remained in this position until 1954, for 15 years. On November 1st, 1954, Pius XII appointed Montini Archbishop of Milan, even though Montini had never even served in a parish. Pius did not name him a cardinal. So this appointment was interpreted as an exile from the Curia, as Milan is an extremely important historic see, and routinely whoever was the archbishop would be a cardinal. So this was interpreted as a kind of a demotion, from being in a high curial office to just being an archbishop. In northern Italy, where Milan was, Lombardy, Montini came to know and respect his a neighboring archbishop, the Archpatriarch of Venice, Angelo Roncalli, the future John the 23rd. They met and corresponded earlier in their career in papal diplomacy, but beginning in 1954, the relationship changed, as at that point they were both engaged in pastoral assignments, and both had lived through the two world wars. Montini was by nature, by disposition, was shy and introverted, and he welcomed the mentoring by Roncalli, for whom dealing with people came naturally. Montini followed Roncalli's example by engaging in personal visitations of every parish in the Archdiocese of Milan, and there were a lot of them, and in reaching out to alienated Catholic workers in Italy, and to non-believers, in whether they had a Catholic background and then just drifted, or whether they embraced a political ideology that was atheist, but reaching out to them in the increasingly secular atmosphere of post-war Italy. Like Roncalli, Montini had lived under fascists before and during World War II. In Milan, he witnessed at a different level, from the ground, so to speak, instead of just reading reports, but actually saw it in his visitations, the devastation caused by the war, by World War II, which was started by the fascists. From the European perspective, the Nazis and the Hitler and Mussolini were right wing, so that's a right wing militarist ideology. For this reason, Montini shared Roncalli's belief that the extreme right wing of the ideological spectrum had caused far more damage in the world than the communists, the extreme left wing. Now, of course, neither of them, as we said with John the 23rd, neither Roncalli nor Montini had ever lived under communist. If they had, they might have had a different view of it. On October 28th, 1958, I'm not saying like both are bad. That's what I'm saying. It's like all extremes are bad. That like the extreme right and the extreme left, I think, are both bad because they both use, you see the Nazis and the communists, they use the same tactics. It was both. They used secret police. They used nullified human rights. The Nazis had the Gestapo. The Soviets had the KGB. They all had death camps. For the Soviets had Siberia. It's the same. It's the same nullification of human dignity for both. So they're both bad because they're extreme, and extremes are disordered. On October 28th, 1958, Montini lost his mentor locally when Roncalli was elected Pope John the 23rd. Montini had not participated in that conclave because Pius XII never did name him a cardinal. 38 days after his election, John the 23rd corrected this by naming Montini a cardinal on December 5th, 1958. Characteristically, for one so painfully shy, Montini only spoke twice on the record during the early phase of Vatican II, but he was more active behind the scenes. His personal contributions were to what became the Decree on Ecumenism and the Decree on Eastern Churches, both causes very close to the heart of John the 23rd. Now, as we covered previously, John the 23rd died on June 3rd, 1963. Montini was elected Pope Paul VI on June 21st of the same year. On June 22nd, the next day, Pope Paul issued the public statement saying that he would continue the council. Before the council actually resumed meeting, Paul made 3 changes. Change number 1. He appointed 4 moderators of the council, which he justified by pointing out that the Council of Trent had 3, so that administrative paradigm had worked for Trent, and he added a 4th because, of course, the number of bishops was much larger at Vatican II. He did this in hopes of streamlining the management of the council, the problems of which he had seen as a bishop on the council floor. These moderators were, and everybody understood, it was put in writing, everybody now understood that these 4 moderators were the senior administrative management authority at the council over the other bodies created by John the 23rd. Now, those other bodies, those other groupings continue to exist because Paul did not want to offend anyone. So to an extent, the administrative problems of the council described previously continued, but at least now there was no longer the basic question. Okay, I want to make a statement on this. Who do I ask? There at least now was a clear executive authority at the council. Second, Cardinal Leo Sunens. We've already met, the Archbishop of Brussels. Like Roncalli, the 4, who the 4 moderators were. The first was Sunens, whom we've already met. Like Roncalli and Montini, Sunens' life experience caused him to regard reactionary right-wing militarism as the most dangerous bane to humanity. He was born in Belgium in 1904. His childhood hero was the Belgian Cardinal Mercier, Mercier, who was the Archbishop of Brussels, where so Sunens was like his descendant, spiritual descendant, in that office. Now, while Sunens was young, his nation was overrun by the armies of the German Kaiser, on their way to invade France in the First World War. This was followed by 4 years of carnage that wrecked his nation and Europe. Cardinal Mercier, who was the cardinal during the First World War, fearlessly, publicly denounced the criminal invasion of Belgium because it was a neutral nation. For this, the occupying German army arrested him, treated him very badly too, which made him a national hero. Cardinal Mercier accepted Sunens as a seminarian as after the war. Mercier survived the war and accepted Sunens as a seminarian for the Diocese of Brussels, and then sent him to Rome to earn a doctorate. Sunens was ordained a priest in 1927, completed his doctorate in theology before returning home. 12 years later, in 1939, it happened again. German troops under another militarist government invaded Belgium. This time it was the Nazis, and the occupation was even more brutal. Sunens, at the time, was teaching at the local seminary. His rector, the rector of his seminary, and many of the faculty were captured and executed by the Nazis. Sunens spent years living with the fear of capture and execution by the Nazis. So he was living in underground, essentially. In disguise. Eventually, he was captured, and he was in line to be sent to a concentration camp. He was only spared by a coincidence in time of the Allied invasion of Normandy in June of 1944, which distracted the Nazis. For the rest of his life, Sunens regarded reactionary conservatism as dangerous and irrational. Montini was sending a clear signal to the whole council by appointing such a man as one of the four moderators, one of the four managers of the council, because everybody knew about Sunens' background. They knew where he stood on things. The second of the four moderators, Gregoire Pierre the 15th, Agagianin, Agianian. He was the Armenian Catholic Patriarch of Cilicia. Born in Georgia, but the European Georgia, which is between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. There are two parallel mountain chains: the Caucasus Mountains, the Greater Caucasus and the Lesser Caucasus. And Georgia is one of the nations in that area between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. So this guy was born there in Georgia in the Caucasus Mountains. Gregoire Pierre, or Gregory Peter, was ethnically Armenian. He had studied at the Urban Seminary in Rome, which was the seminary for mission countries, Catholic mission countries. He spent decades as Catholic Patriarch of Cilicia before the council opened. And so he was an Eastern Rite priest or prelate, and so in union with Rome, but still Eastern Rite. So appointing an Eastern Rite prelate as one of the four moderators of the council was another sign by Montini of the direction he wanted the church to take. So all the other bishops, essentially he was putting this guy over. The others would have to go to him. At least he was one of the four that they'd have to go to ask to get decisions and rulings. So, he's putting him in as one of the four guys in charge of the council. So that's a huge signal. Third of the four moderators, we've already met Cardinal Julius August Dopfner, Dopfner, Archbishop of Munich, Germany. Dopfner did his doctoral dissertation on, surprisingly, on the English Cardinal, John Henry Newman, who's now a saint. And we met him earlier in the course. Döpfner was known to be an outspoken critic of the high centralization of church governance under the papal monarchy throughout the 19th century and into the 20th. He believed that the church's aversion to all things modern, which characterized the reigns of such popes as Leo XII, Gregory XVI, Pius X, especially since 1907 with Pius X's condemnation of modernism with the encyclical Pascendi, and Pius X requiring the oath against modernism. And in 1910 on, he required that at the point where a seminarian would be ordained subdeacon. At that point, they still had 4 minor, 4 major orders. Subdeacon was the first of the major orders. And so from Pius X until after Vatican II, at that point at subdeacon, that's when the seminarian would make their commitment to celibacy and when they would take the oath against modernism. And the antistitia is what the oath against modernism, the title of the oath was antistitia, to stand against. ANTISTITIA. So Döpfner was one who believed that such an attitude had unnaturally disrupted the organic development of the church. And that was the reason that the church was so out of tune with the modern world. Fourth of the 4 moderators was an Italian. That's also striking. So of the 4, only one was Italian. Cardinal Giacomo Lercaro, whom we also met previously, Lercaro. He was he was Archbishop of Ravenna until 1952, and then during the council he was Archbishop of Bologna. And by that point he was a cardinal. So during the Second World War, Lercaro had written for underground, clandestine, anti-fascist newspapers. So anti-Mussolini newspapers, which is risking his life. I mean, that would be considered treason by the government when the fascists control the government, which would be, either a very brutal imprisonment or just execution. And Lercaro had operated under aliases underground to spread forged baptismal certificates, hoping to protect Italian Jews from capture and extermination. As the war progressed, and that dodge was increasingly ignored, Lercaro was part of the underground railroad, so to speak, that tried to physically smuggle, physically remove Jews from the country. By the last year of the war, 1945, Lercaro was a hunted fugitive from the fascists. Not sleeping in the same place for 2 nights in a row kind of fugitive. But he survived. So as a reward for risking his life for so long, Lercaro was ordained Archbishop of Ravenna in 1947, then Archbishop of Bologna in 1952, and then the following year in 1953 was made a cardinal. Lercaro scandalized many in Bologna specifically, as well as in the rest of the church, especially in Italy, where where this would be more, more local news. He scandalized many by establishing regular dialogue with members of the Italian Communist Party. And remember the context. This is the 50s, and this is the Cold War. Once again, we have another of the 4 was a man whose life had been in danger under fascist rule, who saw conservatives as the real threat to civilization. And again, he was yet another guy who had never lived under communist. So they hadn't done anything to him. So to him, they did not seem so bad. Certainly not as bad as what the Nazis and fascists had done. Appointing Lercaro as one of the 4 moderators of the council was perhaps the most controversial action that Paul VI took in this period. Yet, taken as a group, these 4 appointments were a clear declaration of Paul's intent for the council, serving a function parallel to the encyclicals issued by John the 23rd during the council. Also, in this period, Paul permitted the admission of the laity to the council as auditors, meaning they could actually listen to deliberations, not just to the of the subcommittees, so to speak, not just the public sessions. Now, they didn't have a vote, so that's why they're called auditors, but still, that's a big step. So this is yet another signal by Paul that he intended the council to continue along the path that John the 23rd wanted to articulate an ecclesiology of openness to the modern world. For the same reason, Paul VI relaxed the obligations of secrecy imposed on those attending the council, so that when the next period opened, regular press conferences were held. On September 21st, 1963, Pope Paul VI addressed the Curia of the Vatican, the senior administrative cardinals in the Vatican, informing them that their operations would also be reformed, but it would be handled by him, not by the council. Which brings us to the second period of the council, which physically met. That's what I mean by second period. The time, the second time when all the bishops assembled in St. Peter's. So that took place from September 29th through December 4th, 1963. Paul's opening address on September 29th stressed the pastoral nature of the council and set out four goals. Goal number 1, to fully define the nature of the church and the role of the bishop. Goal number 2, to renew the church. Goal number 3, to restore unity among Christians, meaning the Orthodox and Protestants with us, including seeking pardon for Catholic contributions to creating the rift and maintaining the separation. Goal number 4, to start a dialogue with the contemporary world. On September 30th, 1963, the revised schema for the document on the church was presented. It was revised and reduced by the Peritus. We've already met Monsignor Gerard Phillips. He reduced it from 11 sections to 4. Since ecumenism, religious life, church-state relations were excised from that draft, from the earlier draft, for treatment as separate documents, treatment in separate documents. So from this presentation on, September 30th of 63, the document on the church was titled Lumen Gentium, Light of Christ. Light of the Nations, which is a change from the first draft we saw previously of De Ecclesia. The style of writing was reworked to conform to John's pastoral approach without command language and without condemnation language, so no anathema language. Cardinal Fring, the Archbishop of Cologne, began a commentary on this draft with a strong endorsement. He was followed by the conservative, one of the traditionalists, Cardinal Siri, who mocked the changed literary style, saying, quote, "While we certainly must promote progress in our understanding of truth, it is not progress to say things in a more obscure way." End quote. Cardinal Sunens expressed delight with the new draft. He only suggested that the section on the people of God capitalized people of God, that's a proper term, be moved farther up in the document in order to be covered, like if someone who would be reading it from beginning to end, that they would read about the people of God before reading the section on the hierarchy. And that was followed. That suggestion was implemented. Another of the traditionalists, the Ultramontanes, was Cardinal Ernesto Ruffini, the Archbishop of Palermo, Sicily. He rose to list a lengthy critique of what he characterized as the ambiguity of the pastoral writing style. In particular, first, the desire to express collegiality, he observed, deviated from the biblical foundation, in which Jesus told Peter that he was the rock on which the church would be built, not he and the apostles. Second, Cardinal Ruffini was alarmed at the reference in the document referring to the church as a sacrament. He reminded his listeners, this was a general session, so all the bishops, all the council fathers were there. He reminded them that Catholic, or rather modernist, whom he would regard as modernist claiming to be Catholic, also used such terminology, thereby diluting the correct understanding of the seven sacraments by over-applying the term. As he would say, okay, sacraments should just be for these seven sacraments, not calling the church also a sacrament. Cardinal Jan Alfrink, the Archbishop of Utrecht, then distracted discussions by introducing, moving that there would be an introduction of the permanent diaconate by the council, and insinuating that the permanent diaconate, as distinct from the practice of the diaconate at the time, which was just a step in priestly formation, that the permanent diaconate would not be bound by celibacy. And it went on, and that of course eventually was done. But so it went on like this, repeating the dispiriting antipathy of the previous session between the self-identified traditionalists and the self-identified progressives. After 119 interventions in the form of speeches, actually, spoken from a microphone, plus another 56 interventions submitted in writing for the record, a vote was announced for October 16th. However, on the morning of the vote, a shocking action by Pope Paul VI was announced instead. He had all the ballots collected and burned so that no vote would take place at that time. The self-identified progressives assumed that the traditionalists, that Ottaviani, Ruffini, Siri, and others had gotten to Paul. But that was not the case. Typically, Ottaviani and Ruffini and those types, the self-identified traditionalists, did not operate that way. In fact, they were alarmed because the text was not given to them at all, not even to Ottaviani, who was still, in his ordinary job, was still prefect of the Holy Office. Now, no one knew who was rewriting this for Paul, and it was never revealed. So it is plausible to conclude that Paul, who was an accomplished Latinist, an accomplished writer on his own, was not satisfied with the draft, in the stage it had reached by October 16th, and he just took it himself and rewrote it himself. But we don't know. I mean, we just know that that's what happened. Meanwhile, the council debated whether to generate a separate document, a distinct document on Our Lady, the Blessed Mother, which is what the Ultramontanes wished, or to include her in the Constitution on the Church, which is what the progressives wanted. So a vote on that took place on October 29th, 1963. And in this case, the progressives won only by 40 votes, but still they won. So the council's final treatment of Our Lady is in Lumen Gentium, in the Constitution on the Church. The next day, October 30th, 1963. Instead of a revised draft of Lumen Gentium, which had been taken away from them on October 16th, the Council Fathers were presented with 5 questions from Pope Paul, on which they were to vote individually. So the Council Fathers would have cast votes on all separately. So it wasn't all 5 and cast one vote on all. It was just question 1, vote. Question 2, vote. So, that way. So, question 1. Is ordination as a bishop the supreme grade of holy orders? Or is ordination as a bishop merely a higher jurisdiction of priestly ordination? So in other words, is ordination as a priest, is that the fullness of the priesthood? And so when you're a bishop, you just have more jurisdiction, more obligation? Or is ordination as a priest not the fullness of the priesthood, but bishops the fullness of the priesthood? So the vote was yes to that the ordination of bishop is the fullness of the priesthood. The vote yes was 2,123 versus the no votes 34. Question number 2. Is every legitimately ordained bishop part of the College of Bishops in union with other bishops and the Pope? Yes, 2,154 versus no, 104. Question number 3. Is the College of Bishops in union with the Pope successor to the College of Apostles? Yes, votes 2,148 versus no, 336. Question number 4. Is the power of the College of Bishops by divine institution or merely by delegation from the Pope? Yes to divine institution, 2,138 versus no, 408. And question number 5. Is the reinstatement of the permanent diaconate opportune? Yes, it is. Votes 2,120 versus no, 525. The draft was then sent back to the coordinating commission for revision of the text in keeping with those 5 yes votes, and then argument continued on other issues. November 18th, 1963, the schema, the outline of a document on ecumenism was introduced by Joseph Martin, Bishop of Rouen, France. The draft included Jews and religious liberty as part of the content. Speaking in favor was Émile Joseph Desmet, that's D-E-S-M-E-T, who was the Bishop of Bruges, B-R-U-G-E-S, and he was also vice prefect of the Secretariat for Christian Unity. So this was, he had a background in this. He argued that religious liberty was in fact part of Catholic tradition from the beginning. He regarded the anti-ecumenical hostility prevailing throughout the 19th century to have been a distortion prompted by a naturally defensive mentality that emerged in reaction to the wars of religion, the persecution by the French Revolution and subsequent revolutions. Therefore, he concluded The document's language in favor of religious liberty was not a rupture with tradition, but was rather a sweeping away of historical specific accretions to reveal the original evangelical core. And he received a standing ovation. Cardinal Ruffini, speaking for the traditionalist, responded with the standard apologetics of the day, that Christ founded only one church, the Roman Catholic Church. Everyone is free to repent of their errors and find salvation by coming to that one true church. Therefore, promoting liberty for religious error is, Ruffini argued, illogical and harmful to the common good. The bishops of the United States, who attended, but up to this point were largely in the background, for this argument they became more vocal. They regarded it as essential to get a conciliar statement in favor of religious liberty, to free their own people, Catholics in the United States, from the routine accusations in the American context that Catholics are existentially bigoted and incapable of being loyal citizens to a non-Catholic government. So the bishops in the United States hoped that the positive articulation of religious liberty in this document would give them ammunition to neutralize that critique and say, yeah, you see, that a church council agrees with the United States on religious liberty. That's, to put it another way, that's what they wanted. This second period of the council produced only two documents, document on the liturgy and a document on the means of social communication, both dealing with the public actions of the church, public actions spiritual in the liturgy, and public actions temporal, with communicating, through the media, as we'd say today. These were leftovers. These two documents were leftovers from the preparatory and the first periods, with the final text ready for a vote by the end of the 63 session. So, document number one. The Sacred Constitution on so there ended up being 16 documents of the council. This is document number one, the Sacred Constitution on the Liturgy, the Latin title Sacrosanctum Concilium, December 4th, 1963. Substantial in length, 130 numbered sections. Votes in favor, 2,147. Votes against, 4. Ottaviani, Lefebvre, Ruffini, and Siri. Liturgy, perhaps the most visible and for some controversial outcome of the council, was in the area of liturgy. Now, since no one studies history, then as now, these actions were viewed as something new. But taken in context, we know that this was the culmination of a liturgical movement that had been developing for 130 years by the time the council opened. So it started during the reign of Gregory XVI in the 1830s. It began in that crucial post-Napoleonic period when the West was trying to find a new equilibrium in legitimacy and ultramontanism. In 1833, the liturgical movement began when Prosper Guéranger, a French priest, reopened the long-abandoned abbey of Solesmes in France, thereby reestablishing the Benedictine order with the permission of Pope Gregory XVI. And as we traced previously, the movement spread throughout other countries and grafted onto pre-existing movements in each of those countries. Biblical studies in Germany, patristic studies in France, social activism, especially labor rights activism, in Belgium. And from that, was brought to the United States, where it also became involved in other sorts of activism, racial rights, for the civil rights in terms of race, women's rights, and later in the 60s and certainly into the 70s, anti-war protesting. Liturgical ritual is an expression of theological belief. The Catholic axiom, the way we pray is the way we believe. So it was natural that the two ecclesiologies we've been following would have entirely different conceptions of the role of liturgy in the church. The self-identified traditionalists, the ultramontanes, the conservatives, whatever, their view of the liturgy of the Mass was that it was the occasion for a miracle. Jesus connected the bread and wine with his body and blood in the Gospel of John, chapter 6, and in the accounts of institution of the Eucharist. Part of those accounts of institution was the command, "Do this in memory of me." So the Mass is not merely a human action. The Mass is done in obedience to a divine command. At the Mass, part of the Mass is the Eucharistic prayer. Part of the Eucharistic prayer includes an invocation for God, a calling upon, the epiklesis, the epikaleo means to call upon. So is a calling upon God to send the Holy Spirit upon the gifts of bread and wine. Before that prayer is offered, before the words of institution are pronounced, clearly expressing that the Church makes no pretense at causing the transubstantiation by its own authority alone, or by any individual power of an individual priest. Rather, the transubstantiation, the miracle, is accomplished through the miraculous intervention of God sending down the Holy Spirit. So for those having this ecclesiology, this understanding of the Mass, the people understanding the words of the Mass is irrelevant. The miracle takes place through the power of God. Whether the congregation understands all of the words or not. On the other side, the self-identified progressives' view of the liturgy, or the liberals' view of the liturgy, generally shared belief in the miraculous. I'm not aware of any of them at Vatican II that denied the Mass was a miracle, or that the Mass is a supernatural act of the Church. Some of them were accused of that, but I'm not aware of any of the, those who were called liberals. I'm not aware of any of them repudiating belief in the real presence. However, they had a different emphasis. Their focus, they focused on the gospel accounts recording that Jesus first celebrated this in the context of a meal with his apostles. For that reason, the progressives felt that the Church's continued celebration should emphasize this precedent, this meal precedent, because a meal, by nature, there's more than one person involved, so it's a communal action. And that this, focusing on this precedent, would substantiate an ecclesiology of the Church as community. This is the koinonia. Koinonia is the Greek word for community. So the koinonia ecclesiology. Such a view is the view that promoted, which we saw back in Gregory XVI's reign, the full, conscious, active participation of the faithful in the Mass, in the liturgy. Seeing the liturgy as a shared, as being shared, the shared action of all those gathered, and that it is not just a ritual sacrifice. In this context, the offering of communion under both kinds was regarded as a fuller expression of the meal aspect and an encouragement of the full conscious active participation by the faithful. Such participation from the progressive view required the faithful to understand what they were participating in, meaning understanding the language, understanding every word. Now, of course, bilingual missals with Latin on one, Latin and the vernacular on the facing pages, that had been in print for decades. But the liturgical reformers saw no reason why a bilingual missal was needed, when the obvious method, from their perspective, to ensure full comprehension was simply to have the sacraments celebrated in the vernacular language. Okay, so the document, Sacrosanctum Concilium, accepting the progressive demand for full conscious active participation by the laity, brings us to an excerpt from section 11. Quote, "Something more is required than the mere observation of the laws governing valid and licit celebration. It is their duty also to ensure that the faithful take part, fully aware of what they are doing, actively engaged in the rite, and enriched by its effects." Acceptance of the liturgical movement's demand for revision of the liturgy, of the text of the liturgy, brings us to an excerpt from number 23. Quote, "That sound tradition may be retained, and yet the way remain open to legitimate progress, careful investigation is always to be made into each part of the liturgy which is to be revised. This investigation should be theological, historical, and pastoral, and care must be taken that any new forms adopted should in some way grow organically from forms already existing." So that's the hermeneutic of continuity. The final document, the council's document, included incorporation of bishops into the process of liturgical revision, striving for simplicity, emphasizing text from the Bible, and participation by the faithful. This was a very different approach from the Council of Trent, which confined implementation to the Holy See. Which brings us to an excerpt from number 25. Quote, "The liturgical books are to be revised as soon as possible. Experts are to be employed on the task, and bishops are to be consulted from various parts of the world." To reassure traditionalists that no dogmas were going to be changed in these revisions brings us to number 47. Quote, "At the Last Supper, on the night when he was betrayed, our Savior instituted the Eucharistic sacrifice of his body and blood. He did this in order to perpetuate the sacrifice of the cross throughout the centuries until he should come again, and so to entrust to his beloved spouse, the Church, a memorial of his death and resurrection." Then skipping down to number 55, quote, "That more perfect form of participation in the Mass, whereby the faithful, after the priest's communion, receives the Lord's body from the same sacrifice, is strongly recommended. The dogmatic principles which were laid down by the Council of Trent remaining intact, communion under both kinds may be granted when the bishops think fit, not only to clerics and religious, but also to the laity, in cases to be determined by the Apostolic See, as for instance, to the newly ordained in the Mass of their sacred ordination, to the newly professed in the Mass of their religious profession, and to the newly baptized in the Mass, which follows their baptism. The importance of this document, therefore, was not in dogmatic teaching, which the document itself stated was not being changed. The document was of profound importance in its explicit incorporation of a pre-existing movement of liturgical reform into a magisterial document of the Church. This document did not itself revise any rite or sacrament of the Church, but rather it called for such revisions to be made. For that reason, the real battles over the liturgy would be in the post-conciliar period, the Guitar Wars, as they're called in American church history. The second document from this period, document number 2 out of the 16, the Decree on the Means of Social Communication, Latin title Inter Mirifica, through Marvelous. December 4th, 1963, brief compared to the first one, 32 numbers. In favor, 1,960. Against, 164. The means of communication had vastly expanded in the modern and contemporary periods. A few examples. March 10th, 1876. The first telephone call was successfully made by Scottish inventor Alexander Graham Bell. 1895. The first radio signal was sent in Italy by Guglielmo Marconi. In 1902, the first radio broadcast was successfully sent and received across the Atlantic Ocean. 1924. The first moving silhouette images from one screen were sent over a wire and reprojected onto another screen by Charles Jenkins and John Baird. In 1927, Bell Telephone Labs used this technology to send the first images long distance from Washington, D.C. to New York. The following year, 1928, the first television station opened. 1928. It was W3XK. In 1931, Pope Pius XI opened Vatican Radio. Over 3 decades had passed since then, since Vatican Radio. Radio and television, as well as movies, were assuming increasing prominence in the culture of the West. At issue in the debates over this document was not only whether or not the Church should employ these new means of technology, but also the inherent danger they presented for deforming the development of the person and society. The propaganda would be fresh on people's minds because of the use, for example, that the Nazis made in propaganda, their anti-Jewish propaganda, as well as other, But that's one that would be prominent on their minds, since all these people were adults during the Second World War. Okay, so a summary teaching can be found in number 14 of the document. So here's an excerpt, quote, "First, a good press should be fostered. This can be done particularly by supporting and joining in projects and enterprises for the production and distribution of decent films, by encouraging worthwhile films through critical approval and awards, by patronizing or jointly sponsoring theaters operated by Catholics and responsible managers. Similarly, effective support should be given to good radio and television programs, above all, those that are suitable for families. In addition, there should be an effort to see that the noble and ancient art of the drama, which now is diffused everywhere by the media of social communication, serves the cultural and moral betterment of audiences. Okay, the second period of the council closed on December 4th, 1963, with the promulgation of these two documents, on the Sacred Liturgy and on mass communication. Paul used the intercession period, the recess period, so to speak, in the same way that John the 23rd had used encyclicals during the preparatory period and the first period of the council to make his views known to the world. Specifically, Paul VI made a papal pilgrimage to the Holy Land from January 4th through January 6th, 1964. In a papal discourse given at Nazareth on January 5th, 1964, the Feast of the Holy Family, St. Paul and Paul VI interpreted the hidden life of Jesus at Nazareth, while growing up, the hidden life of Jesus at Nazareth, as offering a lesson on the importance of silence in growing closer to God, a lesson on family life as a communion of love and school of the gospel, as well as a lesson on the dignity of work, as Jesus learned the trade of carpentry from his foster father, St. Joseph. This discourse is used in the Catechism, the current Catechism, number 533. Paul VI had seen that the divisions among the Council Fathers were deep, and he knew that the agenda for the next period would include debating the nature of the Church and its relation to non-Catholic churches. So this visit to the Holy Land was a dramatic gesture announcing his attitude. The context makes this clear when one considers that since 1948, the Holy Land was, at least in large part, controlled by the State of Israel, which was an officially Jewish state. Added to that, Paul VI arranged a historic meeting with the Orthodox Patriarch Athenagoras I, who was the 268th Patriarch of Constantinople. And their meeting took place in Jerusalem. So coming 1 month after the second document of the Council embraced the use of modern means of communication, the television images of this meeting delivered the document's teaching to far more people in the world than would ever actually read that second document of the Council. In June of 1964, still in the intercession recess, Schema number 17 became Schema number 13, the future document Gaudium et Spes on the Church in the modern world. And here, Karol Wojtyła enters our story. That's Karol, Karol, which Charles. Wojtyła, Wojtyła, Archbishop of Krakow in Poland. This is, of course, the future Pope St. John Paul II. In June of 1964, he submitted comments on the evolving text of Gaudium et Spes. So to step out of the chronology for a moment, later as Pope, John Paul II referred to this time in his life and its importance to him in the following words, quote, "For me, the Second Vatican Council has always been, in a particular fashion during these years of my pontificate, the constant reference point of every pastoral action, with conscious commitment to translate its directives into concrete, faithful action, at the level of every church and of the whole church. So that statement was made on January 25th, 1985, which was an anniversary of John the 23rd's announcing that he was calling the council. On June 23rd, 1964, Pope Paul VI announced to the cardinals the existence of the Papal Commission on Birth Control, which, remember, had actually been put together by his predecessor, John the 23rd. And also remember, from this is 64, so this is only 4 years after the birth control pill came on the market. So, from their perspective, this was something new. As the next period of the council approached, on September 6th, 1964, Paul announced that women, both lay women as well as religious nuns, sisters, would be allowed to attend the council as auditors. Though, as with the laymen, admitted in the previous period, he did not go so far as to grant them votes. Yet, it was a gesture, declaring his receptivity to change. And that was a huge change in church history. He opened the third period of the council 8 days later on September 14th, 1964. So we will pause here, and then we'll pick up with that next time. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.